Good evening, everyone. I hope you guys are well and that you haven't had too trying a week so early. Uh, if you guys want to get started, do you want to just pop any questions that you have into the chat? Okay, guys, if there aren't any questions, I'm going to move on to Learning Unit 4. I know a few of you have received an extension for your assignment. So far, I have looked at the assignments that were submitted and they're looking great. Everyone seems to have hit exactly the right points. The only thing I would maybe point out is that when you guys do the graphs, maybe make a point to include the arrows to show how both price and quantity are being impacted with regards to demand and supply. Let's see, beyond that, you guys nailed the mark allocation. If there were 20 marks and 4 economic systems to talk about, you gave me 4 facts and 1 example, which was pretty much perfect. Yeah, I'm working my way through it. I'll try and get those results to you guys as soon as possible if anybody in the room has submitted. If not, and you guys have any questions regarding the assignment, please just let me know. I'll help you through in any way. I've also got all the learning units open and ready. So if you've got any questions relating to anything from learning unit 1 to 4, yeah, just let me know, or you can just unblock your mic and we can chat about it. Okay, so learning unit 4 in your textbook relates to chapter 5, okay, and it's about the changes in demand and supply. So I know that the graphs are quite tricky. I see that some people were struggling with the graphs. So we'll actually focus a little bit on that today as well. So if there's anything about the demand and supply curves in particular that you're not quite certain of, please feel free to ask. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about changes in demand and supply and how those different things, how we actually graphically depict those changes. All right, so now if you look at this graph on the right-hand side, okay, this is an ideal version of what we would like to have seen for example, like 5.1 in your assignment, okay? It showed a shift in the demand curve. It showed an increase in price and an increase in quantity. Now, I believe it was 5.1. Let me just check. But it was the one related to, so the reason that the demand curve has actually shifted in this case is because the reason it shifted had nothing to do with the price of the product. Okay, so only when it directly relates to the price of the particular product that we are dealing with, that is when we have movements along the curve. Okay. Otherwise, if there is any other change, if there's a change in taste or preferences, in income, if your substitute product gets cheaper, if your cause complementary good gets more expensive, you guys will find all of this in chapter 4 as well in your textbook. There are tables that you can refer to, and I've made all of these lecture slides available to you too. So if there's still any questions, please just feel free to pop me an email. Oh, also, what I'll do is I'm going to create a form link for you guys. So it will be right under our recordings under ARC. And there I will have a Microsoft form. And if you have any questions that you encounter during the week or while you're going through your work, you can just pop it in there, and then I will tailor make our presentation, our Tuesday lectures to your questions. Okay, so with demand and supply. Okay, it's very important that you always remember that price is always going to be on your y-axis, your vertical axis, and quantity is always going to be on your x-axis. Okay, so the reason for this is that the law of demand, so what this demand and supply curves, or what this graphic is essentially telling us, is it's depicting the demand and the supply laws. Okay, so the law of demand indicates that the lower the price of something, the more consumers will demand. Okay, whereas obviously the law of supply indicates the opposite. The higher the price, the more producers want to supply to the market. So that's why you only have movements along these curves. What this graph is showing us is that it's depicting the market forces that are essentially governing the price and the quantity that are available to consumers in the market from the producers. So when we hit a point where our SS curve, which is your supply curve, and your original DD curve meet, you hit something called equilibrium, market equilibrium, you have market clearance price. They refer to it using a few different synonyms, but essentially it is just the point where demand and supply are equal to each other, where we have a balance in the system, okay? Now let's just remove the noise. Okay, so chapter 4 looks predominantly at just outlining these exact curves. Okay, so just demand and supply. But by the time you start getting to chapter 5, they want you to start being able to graphically depict different scenarios. So in this example, okay, so a shift affects both equilibrium, price, and quantity. Okay, so what you will notice is when we graphically depict something that has nothing to do with a change in price. For example, here, our product is $12. Okay. The price of our product did not shift, but some outside force, whether it be, obviously, we have previously looked at the different factors that influence your demand, but it's the biggest ones that we will look at later in this chapter again are substitution and income. So, for example, if your income increases, you in your country. Okay, so for example, in China has had let's not even go so far. Rwanda has had a monumental economic growth, shall we say, pattern or upswing for the last few years. So this is what they would see in their demand curves. Okay, it had nothing to do. So if this is graphically depicting their demand for, let's say, cell phones or laptops, something technologically advanced that they would not necessarily have had access to before, the average income in the country of Rwanda increased to a level that they could afford to either produce the product themselves or import it. So so the price of laptops, let's call them laptops. Oh, that's very cheap. Let's say cell phones. So the price of cell phones is still $12, but the income of the general population has increased. So that has led to an increase in the demand at the same prices. So what a shift in the demand curve indicates that it is at every price level, we are now willing to demand more. Okay, so yeah, then we'll again look at the substitution effect as well. Obviously, if the opposite happens, like what is very possibly going to happen in South Africa with the VAT increase, for example, so now things are about to get more expensive, but not because of a change in the product. The price of the product hasn't adjusted. It is an outside anomalous occurrence that is now going to be impacting our demand curves locally. So now if we have, for example, fewer people being employed, because obviously, there's a whole ripple effect onto if they cause inflation, then unemployment tends to spike. And so, but if this was the case and we actually had a decrease in demand that had nothing to do with the price of the product, then we would have a shift leftward. Okay, so what is important and what is missing from this particular graph that I've pulled from this reference is that right here in quantity, the quantity changed from 80 to 115. There must be an arrow there to graphically indicate that you understand that the quantity has increased while the price has not. Okay, so you both have to show that the demand curve has shifted. Okay, you show that in two ways. The most obvious one being the arrows, which show the direction of the shift. And the second being how you label your demand curves. So your original curves are by convention labeled D and D on either side. And then your new demand curve can be any variable higher than that. So it would be D1, D2, D3, as it shows how the demand curve is moving. And obviously, because you're looking at them concurrently, you can, as we'll show later, move multiple curves, but as long as you are showing them in order or sequence, you can understand how the market has actually adjusted to anomalous scenarios. Okay. Exactly the same thing happens with changes in supply. So when you guys are drawing these graphs, okay, very quickly, if you see the word consumer or demand or uh, higher quantities and lower prices, you know that you're going to have to draw a demand curve. If in the question they talk about producers, um, manufacturers, industry, firms, that is indicating to you that there is a supply curve. Okay, so it's not always necessary for you to draw both. Obviously, you're not going to be, especially, I will not penalize you for drawing. For example, if you were to draw a shift in the change in demand, and that is what is requested or required for the question, but you also included a supply curve that doesn't move. You will not be penalized for that. But if you are in a time crunch situation, for example, if you want to take this further or if you ever have to write on campus, heaven forbid, but if that were ever the case, then just know that only if you see consumer or only if you see producer firm, something that indicates that you are now also having to consider the supply side, then you don't actually have to draw the supply curve. You won't be penalized for leaving it out if it's not included in the question. Okay, so there are key words that you're looking for. Okay, so again, changes in the supply are if they are impacted by price. Okay, so Of course, there is an increase in the demand for, let's leave out demand. Let's just say that producers want to have an overstock of a certain product, so they try to push more out into the market. Okay, the higher the quantity, okay, the cheaper it gets on the demand side. But for the suppliers, the higher the price, the more they want to push out. So the two forces, obviously, as I've mentioned many times, work in opposition to one another. So this chart is indicating that something outside of price has now impacted supply. I believe in your textbook, it's on page 86. You have a full table of all of the factors that can influence supply. There are a number of them. Okay, it's everything ranging from a change in the cost of the factors of production. It could be government intervention. It could be some sort of natural disaster. So, for example, if we had a natural disaster which prevented us from importing, let's say, what do we import? Something close to our hearts, cocoa, okay, in the form of chocolate and coffee. So if there is a natural disaster in Brazil and they all of a sudden are now no longer able to provide us with the same level of or the same quantity that they have previously been supplying to our market, that would cause a shift in the supply from C to A. Okay, so that's an automatic shift in the opposite direction. Okay. Obviously, I just want to give you an indication because the previous one was an increase in demand. So just here, if we're looking at the opposite, so there's a natural disaster in Brazil, what that would do is it would automatically shift the quantity that we are able to retrieve or get into our country leftward, which means that at every price, we are able to receive less. What would inevitably happen in that scenario? The price would rise. Okay. So as the market would recover, we would go from A back up to B. Why? Because obviously you guys understand that if cocoa is no longer or becomes a scarce commodity in our country, essentially what happens is it starts a bidding war. So in order for the here we go. I'm just going to switch back to this graph. In order for our demand and supply forces to be in balance, and they are always trying to be in balance, what would naturally happen is that we would have to have an increase in price so that the supply that is available can at least meet the demand that is able to pay for it. Okay, so you'd have a movement along your curve here. Okay, because price would now be the leading factor. So as long as it's price, because you have price and quantity as your independent and dependent variables on your X and Y axes, if something happens to price, you are not shifting your curve. It is only if they present you with either, if they say complementary goods, substitution, income increase, preference or taste, new information, any of those key phrases indicate that it has nothing to do with the original price of the product just changing. And therefore, it would cause a shift in your demand or your supply curve. Okay. Everyone okay with that? Okay. Again, I do understand that the graphs are a bit of a tricky one. I have also uploaded a few activities for you guys to do on ARC, just to just knowledge checks, just, the most important thing is obviously that you know what you don't understand. And so we can close those knowledge gaps as we go. All right. Now, here we're going to start talking about the substitution and the complementary effect. Okay, so this is obviously something that was also in your test. We're just going to look at it in a little bit more detail here. So this is one when changes in one market impact another market. So the price in coffee rises because there's an issue in a Brazilian rainforest. Therefore, we start increasing our demand for tea. Okay, you've got to get your caffeine somewhere. So you would naturally just shift to your substitute. Okay. Another one that's obviously an easy and obvious substitute, I'm pretty sure it's in your textbook as well, is butter and margarine. Butter obviously being fat, animal fat based, whereas margarine is petroleum products. No, I'm joking. It's it's plant matter, okay, that they obviously rework into margarine. Now, if the price this is a perfect example because here we think about the different examples. Any of you have a preference for butter over margarine? Okay. You don't, if you're not comfortable opening your mic, I totally understand. No worries. If you are, please feel free to share. But even if you just hold it in your mind, okay, which one you prefer, butter or margarine? Okay, so I don't know about you, but a few years ago, Butro, which was obviously quite premium, was it 60 Rand? Okay, now you can't get it for under 100 Rand for 500 grams. Okay. In the same space of time, margarine has gotten considerably cheaper. Okay, so margarine, when they were first sort of like prompting the switch, was obviously endorsed by the Heart Foundation, and they were anonymous, sorry, and not anonymously, I can't, they were trying to cause a phenomenon that was outside expectations, a shift in the demand towards margarine based on these new health facts that were emerging. Okay, so what if inevitably happened? Now we can look 10 years later, because the margarine sort of had these anomalous shifts in demand, and butter was obviously the substitute product that was losing out in the market. Over a period of time, what happens is that butter is now almost being priced out of the market simply because if you want it, now producers are saying you're going to have to pay for it because it is now more expensive for them to produce it because they can't take advantage of something called economies of scale. Economies of scale, okay, I'm sure if you guys have done business economics or maybe even economics earlier, you would have encountered this term. What it means is the more we produce, the cheaper it is to produce each unit. So because we have reduced the demand for butter to such a low level, we've almost created our own premium product out of something that was commonplace before that. It is now demands a higher price. And concurrently, what we did at the same time is because we did damn it, I said it again. Because we strangely demanded more margarine, we have now achieved economies of scale. So the more we buy, the lower the prices actually get. And the more competitive the market gets. That's why there are so few brands of butter left and so many brands of margarine. Okay. Whenever you get stuck with these economics issues, try to think of a product that you can relate these graphs to, or that you can relate, just the scenario to, something a little bit easier to understand. All right. deep breaths. It's not as complicated as it looks. Okay, so occasionally in our markets, and this is actually what happens on sort of a daily basis, is what's really happening in our markets is that we get simultaneous changes in demand and supply. Sometimes they're both shifted for different reasons, and the magnitudes of those shifts are different as well. So if demand increases more than supply, then both price and quantity will rise. But for how long? Okay, let's use our butter scenario right here. Or maybe perhaps even let me see, what are we doing here? Yes, this is a bit of butter and margarine. Okay, so here in our original graph, we have only two lines. You have S and you have D, okay? You can see because sequentially that is obviously where we start. That would be S0 and D0. At that market equilibrium, we were paying PE and we were willing to accept a quantity of QE, okay? The E obviously just denotes equilibrium. You can obviously describe them as P1, PQ, and you can make them relate to your graphs in the same way. Then what we have is, let's say originally we have a shift in the supply curve from S to S1. Okay, what does that do? Well, originally, or in the short term, our demand curve wouldn't move, which means we are simply now have an abundant supply and our demand for the product hasn't changed. There hasn't been an anomalous shift in demand as yet. We are simply dealing with only an anomalous shift in supply. So for some reason, let's say, just like your petroleum jelly example, we have decided to open the taps. OPEC has said we're going to be producing more petroleum products. We're going to be refining more oil. Therefore, we will have more petroleum jelly. Okay, what does that do? That shifts our supply curve to the right. Why? The price of of petroleum jelly or Vaseline had nothing to do with why the supply and demand equilibrium has now changed. It was only because they've essentially flooded the market with the byproduct of the thing that they are actually trying to create. So what that does is it increases the quantity that we are willing to accept. But because they've now flooded the market, they've now opened the doors for people to be able to say, since there's so much, there's less scarcity, there's less competition, so I'm going to only pay P1. Okay, you can see the second red line over here. It is a reduction in price and an increase in quantity. Okay, so obviously, from a supplier standpoint, you are now producing more. So if it was simply a byproduct, that's great. If it's something that you are specifically, you can think for yourself in your actual manufacturing environment. If for some reason we start producing more of a product beyond what we had asked for, okay, sometimes they overrun a production ticket, for example. Then we get forced to push those products into the market. What does it do? It harms the price of all the products that we've already provided to the market, because now we're flooding our consumers with more product. So they say, well, since there's so much, we'll pay less and we'll take more. Okay. How that impacts profitability is obviously depends on if they give you numbers, okay, for you to actually work it out. But they won't actually ask you to work out profit, because that's from an individual firm perspective. And we generally look at industries as a whole when we're doing these graphs. Okay. Now, the second scenario now takes place. Okay, so for now, for some anomalous reason, we now find out, okay, so this is almost exactly our petroleum jelly scenario, only we're combining the two graphs into one. So now we find out, my goodness, petroleum jelly causes cancer. That causes an immediate shift to the left of the demand curve to D1. Why? People now have a reason outside of price. We don't care that it's cheaper than it used to be. We care about the health implications now. So that would cause a shift in the demand curve, again, to D1. That reduces our quantity that we were demanding originally from this beautiful position here back towards QE. Not quite there, but closer to it. But now because we have now found out, so they've both flooded the market, which has negatively impacted their price, and additionally, we found out that this product is not good for us. So we have reduced the quantity that we're demanding, further reducing the competition for those rare or scarce products. So what happens? The price once again drops to its lowest level. And we're still getting more than we originally demanded at the start of the scenario. Okay, so the reason that it is so important, you guys can understand from both a consumer and a producer standpoint, why it's so important to understand these graphs. Because on a day-to-day basis, this is how a market operates. You are either, let's say you are the supplier. Your demand is a certain number of products. If you provide more than is demanded to the market, you are going to force your own price of your products to drop. Okay, because you are making the law of supply work against, or the law of supply work against you, essentially, because you're saying, I'm going to produce more than is demanded, which causes an excess supply. Okay, so anything above the demand and the supply curve meeting, this space above here is your excess supply. Why? Because anything above equilibrium point indicates that we are supplying above QE, and the people are only demanding below QE. So we've pushed an excess supply into the market, which has a very negative impact on our price. Now, if we are so unlucky as to have a second phenomenon occur where somebody finds out that our product is negatively impacting the environment, other people, or our business practices are not sound, then we can have a shift in our demand curve at the worst possible time. The demand curve for oil looks very much like this because it is very much a constant interaction between demand and supply curves. So how much do our consumers want? How much are we willing to pay? How much are the OPEC sisters, the people who control our oil supply, how much are they willing to produce? Obviously, economic demand means that if we have high economic growth, we need oil to fuel our economic growth. So we demand more. But if they just open the taps and allow us to have all the oil we want, then they can't control the price that they get for their oil. And they obviously still have to pay to pull it out of the ground. They've got to pay to refine it. So it's a delicate balance between these forces. Okay. So here's where it becomes a bit of a problem. Government intervention. Okay, so here is where we start introducing government as a third sector. Governments, obviously, especially in your mixed and your command economies, okay, more in your mixed economies, they tend to set price ceilings and floors. Okay, price ceilings are set typically below your market equilibrium price. I will show you a graph that depicts that now. And your price floors are set above market equilibrium. So essentially what government intervention does is it corrupts this natural dance between these market forces. Okay, because the government intervenes and they say, well, for example, we are going to be subsidizing all the production of bread in the country. If that was to happen, wonderful, there would be a flood of a supply of bread into the market. What would that do to the suppliers? It would cause them to now they flood the market, so they would receive a lower price point, because obviously if we're not competing for bread is now nearly, what's it, 16 to 20 rand a loaf. Do you guys remember, is anybody old enough to remember the time we used to pay 10 rand for a loaf of bread? Okay, so what happens is when governments intervene is essentially they're just spreading the costs. What really happens, and I'm sure you guys are doing business economic or business management as well, is that if you're receiving subsidies, it means that it's essentially free money that you're using to lower your production costs. But if your lower production costs are not actually being done through efficiencies, remember our PPC graph, this is where it comes into it. When governments intervene, they're pushing more capital into your PPC graph, but you are now operating at an inefficient level. Why? Because you are not organically growing your business and therefore, getting more machinery and then hiring labor to work on the machinery. Government is essentially saying, here's a whole bunch of money, go and buy the capital. Then you're retroactively trying to, fit the labor and, match the production and the outputs, and it's a bit of a mess. Obviously there is a necessity for government intervention, and that's where the Keynesian economics actually comes into it. And that's the current type of economics that we employ in our most modern systems. But essentially what they do is the idea is that they're supposed to protect the consumers, support producers, and ensure fair competition. But in protecting the consumers and supporting producers, what we lose, or what we tend to lose, is actually fair competition in the long run. Okay, so let's actually look at this. Okay, so and it's quite an interesting way of looking at it, but I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever heard about like rent controlled cities. Okay, so we kind of have rent controlled um, buildings like in PE. I'm sure you guys probably have these, and those are essentially whole buildings where the accommodation is provided to people who only receive an income of, say, 5 to 15,000 or less. Okay, there is a price ceiling put in place in those apartments. So that means that naturally what would happen is that we would be willing for that particular apartment to pay 600. Okay, forgive me that the price is in dollars here, but it is difficult to find these graphs. Okay, so here we are willing to pay a price of $600, and we're willing to take 300 homes. Okay, that is us naturally as individuals in a market economy. But what the government does is they come in and they say, guys, look, what we actually need to protect these consumers, they need to have access to housing. So what we're going to do is we're going to say these buildings are going to be available at a maximum price of $400, which is $200 less than the prevailing price. Okay. What does that do? Well, people who couldn't afford, so at $600, we could only afford 300 homes. But because the government has now set a price ceiling at $400, now 400 people can afford to buy homes. So what they've caused is a shortage in the market. Now, in the long term, the reason I say that, okay, in the short term, this is exactly what it looks like. But you guys can think, if you are property developers, what this would do to your market. If you're on the supply side and you are being told that that there is a market, there's up to 400 people wanting homes, and only half the market is currently able to be satisfied, you'd be like, oh my goodness, I'm going to jump into this market. There's a huge demand. But what quality would you be buying? Quality would you be producing? Quality at $600 a home or quality of $400 a home? So what naturally ends up happening is that the more people we try to cater to, the lower the price point gets, the more shortcuts we have to take to get there. Because businesses still have to run a profit. So what they will do is cut on consumer quality or push the price increases off onto the consumer. So in the long term, it tends to have a very detrimental impact on your industry. Because overall, what you're doing here, so it says, for example, so the reason that the price point is set by the market at $600 is because that's what it costs to build a good quality home. But now what we're saying is there's no market for a $600 home. There is only a market for a $400 home, not because it has naturally occurred, but because there is an artificial ceiling in the price of the rent. Okay, this is what happened to, essentially what was happening to margarine, okay, versus butter, or shall we call them spreads? Okay, so we had a price ceiling. So now people are demanding double the amount of margarine that's available in the market. So now anybody who wants to start producing a spread to satisfy that portion of the market is not going to come in and try and produce at $600. They're not going to try and produce butter. That's why our butter is mostly imported, except for Clover, who does it as a separate run. But it's not a clever business decision to try and produce at 600 if you simply cannot sell it here. So we stop having these products and our market starts to decline. Obviously, as the market starts to decline, these rent control apartments tend to not be taken care of. They tend to not last because we've pulled so many of these, shortcuts. So the quality tends to drop. So the price point tends to drop. So the demand tends to increase. And so we build essentially slums. Okay. So obviously it works the opposite direction. If you've got like price floors, if people are competing for houses, then you end up paying far more than you expected, which is also a dangerous part of, let me just see here. I do look at price controls. I just want to make sure I do cover price ceilings. Do I not cover price ceiling? Oh, there it is. Sorry. Price floors. Okay, so here, a price floor. Okay, so again, coming back to South Africa, a nice at-home example is our minimum wage laws. Okay, so you guys know the supply. Okay, so I want you to just imagine this graph is our wage demand and supply in our country. Our supply of labor is on this S curve. Okay, the more people are willing to pay, the more of us are willing to work. Okay, makes total sense. From a demand standpoint, for producers, the more we demand, the less people they want to hire. Okay. But now what we've done, okay, so obviously there was a natural flow between the two. obviously the ridiculous thing is that some people were willing to, because you had a massive producer surplus here. Okay, people were willing to work for sandwiches, and producers were willing to pay a minimum wage. You had this massive dead loss impact. So what government does is, because some people were willing to accept next to nothing just to be able to be employed. They wanted like 5-10 rand an hour. But the problem was that it's not a living wage. Okay, so people couldn't survive on that. So the government said, okay, you must pay people a living wage. We're not the only country with a minimum wage laws. Many countries have minimum wage laws. Okay, what that does is it sets a price floor above the market equilibrium. Okay, so now think to yourself in a labor market. You, as BCom students and soon to be BCom graduates, will never find yourself in this scenario. Okay, why? Because you're always going to be the top end of the spectrum. But what happened to all of these people here is we now have a price floor. Most producers say, well, it's not really worth it to hire that many people. I'd rather take a lower number. So I'm only going to demand a QD, and I will accept your price floor of PF. So that's the amount, the number of people that are currently employed in our country. Okay, you can see they're employed at a higher than minimum range. This little consumer surplus here on the top is where we exist. But the unfortunate thing is, because the price floor is so high, despite the fact that we have an abundance, an excess of supply of labor, they cannot be absorbed by the market because they are simply too expensive. So what a price floor does is it creates an artificial excess in supply. So if you were to, for example, drop the minimum wage laws, I know this is a political and quite a controversial suggestion, but just in countries like Argentina, they've dropped all of these like regulations and they've gone full capitalism, and they achieved a 7.5% economic growth rate in 1 year. They slashed their government, so they reduced the tax burden on their people, and it reduced regulation around businesses. And now this price floor has disappeared, and the market itself is clearing the unemployment. What does that mean? Remember that if the market is being dictated by simply this, the reason we study, the reason that we make our ideas more valuable, the reason that we invest in ourselves is because we want to push ourselves up the price point. Okay. If you create this price floor that is already beyond what the market can accept, the only people who are able to succeed are the people on the top end of the price market. So your degreed professionals, which if you guys take a look at who contributes our tax, you can see. Okay, salaried employees pay 45 to 50% of our overall tax rate. Why? The price floor has made it's, look how far up you have to get, how valuable you have to be in order to be employed by this market. Think of it as a small business owner. So here you're on the other side, you're on the supply side. If you guys want to start a business right now, think about what you'd have to take on to employ someone, like, legally. Apart from minimum wage, there's UIF, there's retirement funds, there's medical aids, there's, all of these things that you've got to have training and development. You've got to have a plan for them. You've got to have an HR department. You need contracts. All of these things make it expensive to employ someone. So they only employ the top echelons of society. I'm not saying that dropping the price floor would, eliminate our problems, but it would move us closer to market equilibrium. Sometimes it's better to receive a salary of 10 Rand an hour than to receive 350 Rand a month with no prospects. Okay. So in the long term, these government interventions are designed to protect consumers and support producers. But the scary thing is that there is no such thing as a short-term government program. Okay. Welfare effects and price controls, they affect both producers and consumers, but they tend to create dead loss because they artificially manipulate the prices, reducing the overall market efficiency. So if you, for example, as a student, you guys are clearly busy, you might be working, you would very happily employ someone to come and help you like tidy up. But if you've got a minimum wage rate of 20 Rand an hour and you've got to worry about all these other regulations, it's harder to employ someone. So they've created a dead loss in the employee, even though in the labor market, because even though there are people willing to work for that money, it is illegal to employ them. So some people win and some people lose out. Okay, I will post these lecture slides as well. I did just want you guys to consider the long-term versus the short-term impacts of minimum wage, just to sort of, it's easy to put yourself in the position of someone who needs to be employed in a few years or is currently employed. And at the same time, being a business student, what do you have to consider when you're employing people? Um, alternatives to price controls. All right, so here are the other things. Obviously, the other problem is all of these price controls require money to implement. Okay, so it's if we are going to be subsidizing bread, for example, that money has to come from somewhere. And because governments, even you'll see in your economic flows, governments produce nothing. They only redistribute. That is their only purpose in an economy. And if that's the case, then in order to subsidize one or two industries, they have to get the tax money from somewhere else. So essentially what they do is they increase the tax burden on the entire population, and then they subsidize specific areas. So I'm sure you guys would have seen now with the proposed VAT increase. If you guys want to read the budget speech, it's very entertaining. Enoch used to be one of my favorite finance ministers, but since what the last 2 years, what he's done with the tax brackets has not been kind to us taxpayers. So a little bit less so. But what he's essentially done is said, okay, no problem. What we're going to do is we're going to increase the VAT, but we're going to increase the number of zero VAT products. Wonderful. But that simply means that we are now subsidizing the VAT from tax money. So, we'll end up paying on more things overall so that certain areas can be subsidized. And the problem is it's government deciding which areas and which industries are subsidized. So like in China, if we as a people decide that what we actually need is fresh rice because, famine is still within living memory in China. So for them, fresh food is especially important to their culture. But if your government decides that we're instead going to focus on electric vehicles, well, tough. Everybody just got to sort of deal with it. So governments make decisions which are best for them, but not necessarily what the population has voted on or agreed on. And that's why we have these mixed economies. But again, essentially what governments are there to do is to protect consumers and support making our industries more viable, help them employ more people, help them grow so that we can employ more people and our economic growth, our PPC can extend naturally. Okay, so it is so important to understand when we are evaluating these government interventions. Again, we have intended consequences and unintended consequences. You guys have noticed that I'm sure that we had a 350 rand grant that we implemented during COVID. Obviously, it was an economic shock. We borrowed 500 billion rand in order to cater to this like black swan event. That's something that we don't expect, until it actually hits us. And but people are still getting it. So 5 years after the fact, I'm not saying people aren't in fact affected, but 5 years after the pandemic, we are still contributing as taxpayers to a fund that was designed to be temporary, specifically for a designated anomaly. So what they did is they keep increasing taxes in order to keep flooding the population with money, but it's sending money into like random places. You're also not uplifting anyone if you're only giving them 350 rand. There's no possibility of trickle down economics. No one can start a business with 350 rand. Somebody did. Somebody started an ice cream business. Hats off to him. But he was one out of 23 million. So there are real unintended consequences to these things. Okay. Obviously, globally, now we have coordinated actions, so coordinated market interventions. All governments tend to start printing money, or all treasuries tend to start printing money at the same time. All governments start increasing spending during recessions because they're trying to, they try to artificially create a demand, which is supposed to create I don't know, a jump start in our supply and producers because they are now demanding these products from government. But government is not demanding the products the people need. Okay, so when we go to macro, we talk about these different economic macro factors that influence these policy changes. Politics and economics are invariably intertwined. And you'll find that a lot of the economic policies that we've ever implemented, guys, if you want to listen to something just fascinating, listen to the Harvard professors who created our 2008 financial response to the debt crisis, to the interest rate, the mortgage crisis. Okay, they were people. Obviously, the problem was that they had slightly corrupted views because they were actually on the boards of the of the banks that they were supposed to be regulating. So that was a bit of a dodgy thing. And it kind of showed in the policies that they had created. But governments rely on the academics, to sort of dictate how these things are supposed to work, to understand how the market economy grows and what actions they're supposed to take to help the most number of people. The problem is and the reason they do that is obviously is because academia is funded by government. We as taxpayers fund academia, so that we can spur innovation and help society move forward, which is why, if you'll refer back to like my first lecture, I spoke about how technology is the one incredible thing humans created that progressively gets better and cheaper at the same time. So, whereas just an example of that is everyone knows who Bill Gates is, right? Because he was the capitalist that brought us Microsoft, Windows. But no one knows about, what's his name, Brian Gardner. I speak under correction, but he was a Harvard professor and he's the guy who created the internet. Why? The one was done for society's benefit and the other was done for capitalistic reasons. Okay, so capitalism is a very effective system, but it needs an effective counterbalance to stop it from getting out of control, right? You can't have board members can't have companies hiring board members to create the policies that regulate themselves. That's just weird. Okay. There are varying approaches to the healthcare markets around the world. You should honestly look at, there have been a few arguments about having governments uninvolved in healthcare specifically. There are two sides to that. Obviously, we do have the healthcare available, so it should be freely available to everyone, as in our NHI that is now coming into effect. Very valid reason for putting it in place. Only 15% of our entire population of people have medical aid. So we've got the best private hospitals in the entire, well, some of the best private hospitals in the developing world, and yet so few people have access to it. The problem is if you create a price floor, then who's going to pay for the 600 Rand hospital room? Oh, sorry, 6,000. It's actually closer to 10,000 Rand hospital room if you're going to force the price down to 6. So you destroy entire industries over time. And that's why people who take a longer term view are concerned about these sort of short term interventions that are supposed to be very helpful and temporary government policies. But there's no such thing as a temporary government policy. Okay. Do you guys have any questions?
Sorry, ma'am, there are questions in the chat box.
Fantastic. Okay, so here we go. In the case of butter, how could the butter industry recover? Okay, so Danae, how could the butter industry recover? I would say, if I were them, start funding some research about how butter is actually great for your heart. You've got to change the narrative. Look, it's very hard for them to start saying, okay, we're going to go back to the 1996 prices, and we're only going to charge you 20 Rand for butter, because that would destroy the industry itself. Because again, here that would be pushing a demand increase based purely on price. So you've got to look to change one of the other demand aspects. So you've got to change people's tastes and preferences. You could start exploring markets where incomes are higher than ours, in which case, obviously, you'd have a bigger market to sell to with people with more disposable income. What else could you do? You could start an evil campaign about margarine stopping hearts. I don't know. Obviously, that would be espionage and not what we're learning here. But just as an indication, you would need something other than price to bring your consumer demand back to butter. Is there always either a price ceiling or a price floor? Or are there situations where there are neither? There are situations where there are neither. For example, when you guys are, if you look back, if you go back to our first lecture, we talked about AI, for example. Okay, so when we started, we had ChatGPT. They came out and they were like, look how amazing we are. If you have $12, you can pay for the subscription and you'll get access to ChatGPT 4. Okay. But then DeepSeek comes out and it's 50 times better and 24 times cheaper. No price floor, no price ceiling, no protections whatsoever. So OpenAI is experiencing their worst, 4 months of their entire existence, which hasn't been long, but it caused a considerable problem, because the thing about a price ceiling is that it protects your local industries as well. Okay, so think about okay, I'm gonna go for it, guys, but stay with me, no emotions. Just during apartheid, what was the problem? The problem was that the government was actually incentivizing and subsidizing local industries. Okay. What happened then was that we became less internationally competitive because we didn't have to be as good at what we did. We didn't have to optimize our efficiencies because our inefficiencies were being covered by subsidies. So when we eventually had to drop all of our market protections and we had to say, okay, now we're competing with the world on an equal basis, we no longer had those protections, which meant that we were being priced out of the market. We were the number one gold producers in the world because we could pull gold out of the ground cheaper and more efficiently than anyone else in the world. Now, Canada is beating us. I mean, Canada doesn't even make sense. And I think we're sixth. Okay, so what inevitably happens is that like these price floors, even if they seem like they're helping in the short term, in the long term, they make your industry less efficient because they make us less competitive. We have to, you guys know, when you're a student, you've got to budget every rand you get. But when you're a working professional and you are making ample disposable income, you're not overly concerned about a missing 100 Rand here or a missing 200 Rand here. This is how people miss so many of these schemes, because the bigger your scale, the less you're concerned about the little things. So these price ceilings and price floors, the problem is that we often tend to think very short term. We need an immediate intervention. With COVID, we immediately needed to stop people from starving. But 5 years later, why haven't those jobs returned? Why are we still facing a very heavy tax burden and yet our unemployment and our poverty rates are still just as high? You know what I mean? So it tends to make a market less efficient. You want to see a very inefficient market? Look at North Korea. Okay. They produce absolutely nothing. If you want to look locally, look at Cape Town, right? Apart from wine that they export, they produce nothing. They don't manufacture anything. They're direct, like resource based. So they don't have very many protections if some anomalous thing happens. Okay, would it not have been more effective to increase the tax on businesses rather than increasing the VAT? And there you are winning today. That is a very brilliant suggestion. The problem is that is, if I believe, speak under correction, but I think already close to 60% of our tax budget or our government budget comes from businesses being taxed. Also, remember the problem with taxing businesses is that perfect example. Okay, so in America, across different states, across all 50 states, they have different tax rates, right? So they have a federal system, but they also have individual tax systems. So, did you know that Kentucky Fried Chicken is no longer Kentucky Fried Chicken because they moved their headquarters to Texas? I kid you not, guys. Google it. Why did they do that? Texas has a very low tax rate on businesses, whereas Kentucky, not so much. Kentucky they're a blue state. They tend to have higher taxes for businesses. Same thing happens with most businesses. What businesses will do is they will move to a country with a lower tax rate. The reason that the tariff situation was so effective or is so effective for America is that's essentially all they're doing. They're saying, hey, you want access to our markets? No problem. If you're producing in a third world country like ours, okay, if you're producing and taking advantage of a lower wage rate to create your product so that you can bank the product and profit and still sell the rest to our people, then we're going to tariff every product that you bring into our country so that we are going to essentially be charging you the same price that you would have been charged if you had produced it within the country. It's a very clever thing. We've essentially done the same thing with like BEE. We're saying, okay, you can come into our country, no problem. But instead of having a tariff rate, we say 30% of your business must be allocated to locals here. It's actually a very clever thing. It's a short-term policy that which was encouraged to sort of spur a lot of domestic investment because you were going to have your locals invested in your company. So it was like almost a guarantee of security. You're employing South African people and you're an American business, there's a good chance the South African government isn't going to try and come after you because they'd lose those jobs. So that type of thing. So taxes tend to move businesses quite radically. They also tend to not take a hit to their profit. They pass the burden onto the other stakeholders. So they would simply employ fewer people, um, or pay them a lower rate. So yeah, it's always, that's why economics is so interesting because there are intended and unintended consequences. And a lot of the times, what you guys will find is that we will make a decision and it will have an immediate impact. But the true effect of our policy will only really be seen like 6 months to a year later. And the problem is, in that time, things have changed. Scenarios have altered, interest rates have changed, politics have adjusted, but we're always on the back foot. So the problem with government is that they are always retroactively trying to fix something, whereas a market system has natural forces which just try to find equilibrium. So we tend to be a lot more efficient at saying, nope, that's too much. I'm not doing it. Whereas a government can say, not really my money. 25,000 Rand for a chair could be reasonable. That type of thing. Those are some wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Does anybody have any other questions? I unfortunately don't have access to the link, but if someone shares the WhatsApp link, I will share it on our ARC site. If you guys have any questions, I will please just pop it into that form that it will be available to you by tomorrow. And other than that, if you don't have any questions, let me just check notes. Not missing anything. Then have a wonderful evening, guys. Thank you so much for your attention. Yes, Andre. Oh, I see you just leaving. Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Thank you so much, Aneo. Lovely questions. Please attend next week. That was very entertaining. I love it. Have a wonderful week, guys. I'll see you next week.